Good afternoon. We are excited to present a riveting topic for all. We know it, best practices in contract management, but seriously, it's as important of an aspect of grants management and the work that we do in disaster recovery, understanding how best to procure vendors, select subrecipients, and then manage those agreements over the life of your grants is obviously a very critical aspect of the work. So we're excited. We'll have some time at the end for questions and looking forward to an engaging conversation. Quick introductions. Heather, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. So hi, everybody. My name is Heather LeGrone. I work for the Texas General Land Office, where we do all things disaster recovery for the state of Texas. We currently have 9 open grants totaling about $14 billion dating back to 2005. We're a team of about 250 FTEs plus a lot of vendor support to help us out with everything that we do.
Okay, I'm Dave Bowman. I'm currently the Deputy Director with the Colorado Department of Local Affairs. We recently had the Marshall Fire as our latest. Prior to that, we had the floods of 2013, so we deal with water and fire. And before that, I had the pleasure of working in the fine state of Louisiana. I see we have some folks in the back there from Louisiana. For about 9 years, from Katrina and Gustav and Ike, and somewhere in there, my hair went white, and that's what I look forward to. That I'll turn over to Ted.
Thanks, Dave. My name is Ted Gilliott. I'm with Civics. We're one of the HUD TA providers. In former life, I also had the pleasure of serving in the state of Louisiana on the grantee side. So nice to see so many familiar faces in the room.
And my name's Whitney Roche. I'm also with Civics, and I work in our program development area. I've got 15 or so years working a variety of disasters, primarily in Louisiana with flood, but some fire work in California and various other programs here recently. So happy to be here today. Yeah, let's get started. Each one of these sessions begins with kind of the learning objectives. What should your key takeaways be? Structure of our discussion today is going to be, we're going to go through some principles of kind of contract management. I want to save as much time as I can for Heather and David to go through some real world examples, but we will have a few kind of intro slides here. We want to obviously understand the importance of effective and compliant contract management, learn some of the differences of managing contracts as a government entity, go through the life cycle of contract management, dig into each one of those process steps a little bit, understand the importance of managing vendor and subrecipient agreements, and then talk through some common challenges and best practices.
All right, so from an agenda perspective, as Whitney mentioned, we'll go through just an overview of some principles and essentials. The meat of the presentation will be Dave and Heather going through some real world examples of various contracts they've managed from the vendor side and subrecipient experiences as well. We'll talk about some other considerations and common challenges, as well as some of the key requirements from the consolidated notice. Have some time for some summary and key takeaways, and share some resources. Just as a reminder, there was Heather was smart enough with the HOVA app to put some poll questions in there. So if you have not already done so, take a look at the poll questions. It's 3 quick questions, sort of a yes or no kind of thing, and we can review those at the end. I think it's already telling a bit, how folks fall in some of those different distinctions of how and when you procure vendors and subrecipients. So with that, we'll continue on.
So just kind of getting started with contract management overview and essentials. What's the contract do? It's obviously meant to protect your interest. It's meant to establish the rules of engagement, define performance metrics, define potential penalties for not meeting performance expectations. So obviously a good contract management process would be to, ideally it would be to document and report on contracts throughout, so that you're always, ensuring that both you and the other party both know where they stand at any point in time. Why is it important? It improves your process for generating and negotiating and renewing contracts. You can reduce your expenses by standardizing the contracting process. Helps create stronger relationships with vendors and subrecipients. It also helps, ensure level of cooperation and responsiveness through that. And a big one is it helps you mitigate risks. So obviously with the government, with a government agency, you have a couple of different things layers that will kind of play into managing contracts that may not necessarily be there from a private sector consideration. There's, lots of budget and laws and both local and federal, and then rules within your own agency on, the procurement process. So that kind of makes this a little unique for governments. And you've got several key considerations to, consider. You got billing structure, coming up with your performance requirements and penalties, the terms, and then the practicality to actually operationalize the work that you're contracting for. These are the four kind of pillars of contract management principles. You want to start out by establishing the roles and responsibilities of those that are involved in the process so that everybody has a good understanding of their role in the team. You want to plan and execute and standardize to the extent that you can. You want to manage your relationships with effective and consistent communication. And then finally, you want to develop some clear performance standards and come up with some methods to address substandard performance. So a good vendor contracting starts with, a complete and compliant process. You've got to have a clear alignment between your scope, your performance expectations, and the performance and the project schedule. One good thing to always keep in mind is, if it isn't written down, it's going to be difficult to enforce. Incorporate as much as you can in your contracts by referencing, the actual regulation or the Federal Register or the action plan that you're contracting for. You want to try to give yourself an out or several outs to the extent that you can. These are just a few more kind of high-level contracting principles. Touch on a few. Only contract for the time that is needed to perform the work that you're contracting for. Again, going back to regularly scheduled reporting so that everybody understands where they stand at any point in time. And finally, just making sure that you and your vendors or subrecipients understand the contract and have read it and can reference it when needed to understand everyone's obligations.
From a process perspective, thinking about contract management is really starting with a strong procurement process. So there's really, if you're thinking about the life cycle of a grant, a project, or a program, you're managing that over the duration. It's the same thing with contracting. You're not, contract management starts with the execution of the agreement, and then you're managing it, monitoring it over its life cycle. But you really have to think how your procurement policy and procedures lead into successful contract management and ensuring clear alignment in those aspects of the work. So when you're thinking about, okay, how am I collecting information from the outset of a contract? How am I setting myself for successful oversight and performance tracking over the duration of the agreement? How am I leading to a successful closeout of the agreement by actually being able to determine that what you contracted to do was performed as outlined? That's really that life cycle, right? It starts at the beginning, and then you're monitoring that over the course. So it's just important to consider the full life cycle as you're drafting agreements with subrecipients, as you're drafting contracts with vendors, that it sets you up for success over the duration of the term. Similarly, there's more thing that the cyclical process around contracting. I'm not going to go through each of these, but just to think about, as you're drafting things again, you're going to negotiations, you execute, and then you're moving into that management phase. Over the course of it, you're going to have amendments. You might have adjustments to the scope, adjustments to the term, amendments to the budget. All of that feeds into the overall management during the life cycle of the agreement. So again, setting it up from the beginning to be successful is really critical. Considering what you're going to need to do over the duration of the agreement, the duration of the term, and that again, you're authoring things from the outset to fulfill that or those obligations over the course of the engagement. All right, now for the fun stuff. Over to you, Dave.
All right, first I want to just kind of go the three types of contracts. This probably isn't new to most of you, but the vendor contracts or contractor contracts is when somebody is providing a service for you as the grantee. So it might be an IT contract, it might be a staff augmentation contract, but it's not providing direct services to beneficiaries. The other type is the subrecipient agreements. Those are often called grant agreements, and those are typically to a local government or nonprofit to actually serve human beings or build roads and those sorts of things. And then the final one is an interagency agreement. And in Colorado, we have a distinction between an interagency agreement and a memorandum of understanding. If there's actual money changing hands and you're working with another state agency, which is what we often do in Colorado, then it's an interagency agreement. You may have a situation, and we have these as well, where you're working with somebody and you're not exchanging money. You're still doing the payments yourself. When it's a division within the same agency, in which case you'll want an MOU to spell out the responsibilities, even if there's no money changing hands. And this is just the guidance on contract types. The key takeaway here is this is something that is in 2 CFR 200, and it is a requirement for you to actually identify whether it's a vendor contract or subrecipient agreement, and that you're following the rules that are appropriate to each of those types. Common themes. I'm not going to read through all of these, but I want to touch on a couple. Passing down federal requirements. That's key. It has saved us money. If you don't do that, then you could be on the hook. Be very specific in what you need out of the contract, have deliverables. And these last two, payment requirements and reporting requirements, something that we've incorporated is making those exhibits in the contract. You don't want to get, 3 months into the contract and find out you're not getting the reporting data in the way that you actually need it to package it for HUD or for your leadership at the state level. So having all those things spelled out in detail is critical.
So as you move forward with your vendor contract management, one thing that we do in the state of Texas is we pre-position everything that we can. We are repeat customers to the disaster recovery program. It's not if, but when in Texas. So every 4 years, we go through a procurement process so that we can do the whole process and pick our vendors and have them teed up to negotiate with immediately after an event. And then you're also looking for that quality and the timeliness, kind of like what Dave was talking about. You need to have the ability to control those things and get there as you get to those different phases of your grant. One thing that we have learned, lesson learned in Texas for sure, is don't put all your eggs in one basket. Have multiple vendors who can do the same task for you. This has made a huge difference. Vendors in the room, my apologies. You can play them against each other. You can tell them, well, I don't know, but vendor A was able to do it. And it works, guys. They move, things happen. You can do liquidated damages. I will caution you on liquidated damages, however. Even though your contract allows for liquidated damages, if it's your fault, you shouldn't be charging them liquidated damages. Bureaucracy is what it is, guys. You do need to standardize, like Dave was mentioning. Standardize everything that you're doing. Your processes need to be standardized. Your forms need to be standardized. And you need to stick to your guidelines, because as soon as you start deviating and you do it once, the expectation is going to be that you can do it again. And if you're like me, an inch versus a mile, gray, I like to do that to HUD. So my vendors do that to me sometimes as well. And then reward success. One thing that is definitely a good idea, along with the stick that all of those other bullets told you about, is to reward success. A lot of our contracts we write with our various vendors is a pay for performance. So if we give you 5 houses and you build those houses successfully for us, next time you get 10. And then if you do 10 well, then maybe you get 15. And then if you don't do those 15 well, maybe we take you back to 10, but you can get back to 15 if you perform for us again. So the stick and the carrot both makes a lot of sense in your relationships.
All right, I'm going to walk through a Colorado example from the 2013 floods. And I don't know if you can see the organization here, but my unit's box was that center one that says Disaster Recovery Unit. And we had 6 different agencies running 9 different programs. And we had a staff of about 3 at the time. So the way we managed that was through a series of interagency agreements. And then we had to struggle with our leadership to get the capacity to do it right. And we did that through a vendor contract. So what that contract needed to do, it needed to be flexible, but it also had to give us control so that we didn't have runaway spending. And the way we tackled that was through a series of task orders. So we knew we needed staff augmentation. We knew we needed technical assistance. What we didn't know at the time was where do we need to really direct that. As you can imagine, with 6 different agencies, some of them could handle managing federal grants. Others could not. We actually ended up taking over a program from one of the agencies, and they sort of not even reluctantly gave the program back to us. But what we had to do at that point was we had to send the vendor in to actually go and physically fix the program. And that's something we may not have predicted when we wrote the contract, but the way we handled it was through a task order. And the task order you can give them, and I'll talk about this a little bit on the next slide. There's a process that helped us to manage that process. First thing we would do is identify what the needs are, specifically what we want them to do. Then we develop a task order proposal. Usually it's kind of done jointly with the vendor, but they would come in and tell us, okay, for this work, we're going to use this people, this many hours, and we had a defined cost. There'd be some back and forth. I would sign off on it. The vendor would sign off on it. And then once the task order was signed off on, it actually became a part of the contract. And we would get progress reports based on the task order to manage how progress was going. And this image you see on the right is the part that goes in the contract. It's really just a one-pager. It's attached to the contract. It's very quick to implement. We reference the original proposal. It's got the total cost of this next task order. It's got the performance period and then the start date on it. And that's pretty much about it. And there was a way to systematically ramp up and ramp down with the vendor in a way that we needed to meet our needs.
Thank you. All right, so in Texas, we look at several different things when we're executing our contracts with our various vendors. We're looking for what specific deliverables that we intend to do. Dave made a great point, because we intend to do one thing on the front end, but we do have the flexibility within our relationships to add to as needed within our relationships. And we also do both. A master contract is kind of what we call it, with those task orders below it. And we do direct contracts that have a single scope and budget that we intend to purchase from the vendor at the same time. Within our structuring, what we put together is fixed pricing for everything that we absolutely can. If there's a SOP to be developed, a form to be created, a plan to be drafted, front, we identify what that is with all of the requirements of that type of a document. We put a fixed price to that. We don't care how many hours it takes them to do it. We're talking about the final price. They need to bring as many people to the table or one person, however they choose to meet that requirement for us. Then, because we have to, because this stuff changes so frequently, and frankly, you just can't make some of the things up that you're going to see in your programs, we include an hourly pricing within our contracts as well. So I need help with technical assistance for a subrecipient. That might be something that we put out there on an hourly basis. Or like Dave was talking about, someone needs a little bit of extra help, or maybe we just need somebody to move in and do something instead. This is where we start the hourly pricing until we can negotiate that fixed price for that next task that's being amended in. One thing that has served us very well is when you get those RFP responses and they're shiny and they're colorful and they've got all the charts in them and all the big names, y'all all know what I'm talking about. the people who you want working in your program, we write into our contract, those are the people who will work in our program. And our vendors cannot swap out those folks for somebody different unless we agree to it, or they quit. And I can't make anybody stay in their job. But if they are still with the firm, we keep them in our grant. One thing that we have seen as our grants are, revolving into or finalizing out, and Florida gets a big disaster, those folks tend to turn up on those RFPs in Florida. It's like, wait, that's my guy. So keep an eye on that kind of stuff. That's how we particularly do it. We don't do it for everybody. We pick some of the key personnel and key roles that we do that on. And then always include an option for extensions to be exercised as needed. I agree completely with the comment. Don't do it for longer than you need to, but be sure that you can extend it if you have a need arise. None of us could have guessed that COVID was going to happen. And when COVID happened to us, HUD automatically gave us a 1-year extension and allowed us to ask for that second year. Well, obviously, our subrecipients needed that additional time. Our vendors needed that additional time. We were going to last longer, so we needed that support along the way. Set clear expectations up front with we changed gears, subrecipient agreements. So this is a little bit different. These are, in Texas at least, more your partner. These are the folks who you are helping to get across the finish line. This is not a direct procured relationship. This is a partnership. These are the people who were directly impacted by your event. These are the people who you need to help get across that finish line. But you do need to set clear expectations and be consistent. Your subrecipients talk to one another and they will absolutely say, well, in Beaumont, they were able to do this. Why can't I? So be sure that you stick to those guidelines that I talked about earlier and be consistent. Communicate with them often and frequently. Our grant managers touch our subrecipients on a monthly basis and they go and see them at least once a quarter. Be there. Understand what they're doing, be involved in the processes that they are doing. If they are about to do procurement, you're about to do procurement. And be sure that you train them and provide them the technical assistance that they need as they need it. Up front, we do a kickoff meeting with our subrecipient. We hit a whole bunch of topics with them, but we are not going to talk to them about closeouts as we're kicking off a grant. Likely, they're going to forget at best. Quite possibly, it's a whole different crew there before they get to close out anyway. So you just wasted your breath. Be sure that you are consistent and comprehensive in your oversight. Again, your subrecipients are going to talk to one another. Their grant administrators are going to talk to one another. So if somebody gets to do it that way, everybody gets to do it that way. Stick with your guidelines. Always communicate and document decisions. It's really easy to send a quick text or to pick up a phone and have a conversation. You should be having those conversations, but you definitely need to document those conversations. If it's not in writing, it didn't happen. And these are long-term relationships with these subrecipients. It's likely that you're going to deal with one mayor at the beginning, another mayor in the middle, and maybe even a third mayor, particularly with COVID time added in the mix. The staff is going to turn over. Your staff is going to turn over. If your file doesn't tell the story, then the story is not yours to tell. You have to be flexible and you have to plan for change. Again, you can't make this stuff up. We were building a house not too long ago where we struck oil. We literally drilled the pilings to elevate a house that we had demolished, and we literally struck petroleum, guys. We didn't have an SOP for that. So be flexible and be sure that you expect and plan for those types of things to pop out. and show up at the worst possible moments. And then never, never, never pay out ahead of progress. Never, never, never pay all of your admin budget, project delivery, activity delivery, however you term that with your subrecipient ahead of closeout. We had communities with our Hurricane Ike grant who basically looked at it and said, there's only $1,500 left in my budget. You close it. Do not pay them ahead of the documentation that you need from them being delivered.
All right, and just I'm going to piggyback on that a little bit. And talking about risk assessments prior to the contract. I mean, typically, if your grantee is already an entitlement community, they probably know what they're doing, or they're comfortable with it. You have other communities that are not entitlements, and they are terrified of federal rules. And your job is to really help them take something that's very complex and say, we've got this, we're going to hold your hand. You focus on helping your people, and we'll focus on helping you get through this in a compliant manner. So that kind of drives the technical assistance and the monitoring that you need to do. Now, you need to have in your sub-recipient agreement that you can go in and monitor at any time and have access to files. There's nothing worse than getting pushback from a sub-recipient on being able to look at their files. It never ends well. And then a little bit on the passing on requirements. I've seen good contracts and I've seen bad contracts, and the bad contracts have every federal law you can think of, and they're just listed in an exhibit. And the person on the other end of that contract is looking at a list of 20 or 30 federal registers and circulars and this, that, and the other thing. They're just going to sign it. They're not going to go and read all of those. So the better contracts actually have clauses in them around following Davis-Bacon, following Section 3, all those things that you need to do. So they actually know what those things are when somebody on the other end signs it. Using standard forms, I talked about this a little bit earlier. By standardizing forms, you're making sure that you're getting what you need. For those of you that don't have grant management systems that people can load their data into, give them an Excel spreadsheet template and say, this is what our expectation is. When you send us a pay request, you send us this, because there's nothing worse than saying, hey, I need to get your beneficiary data. I need race and ethnicity data. And they're like, oh yeah, we've got that. It's on a handwritten form in every file, and we'll pull it all together for you and get it to you in a couple of weeks. You need to dictate that up front, how they collect it, how you're going to receive it, how often you're going to receive it, et cetera. And option letters are something that we do in the state of Colorado. It's just a one-pager. You do your action plan and you think you're going to serve 200 households and it's going to cost $3 million. And at the end of the day, there's more or less, and you need to adjust the contract. An option letter is it's attached with our contracts as a template, and it's a way you can extend time, you can extend money, and it's unilateral. We sign it and say, yeah, you did get 50 more homes than you expected. Here's another, $150,000, go to town, and then you don't have to go through the whole amendment process with that. I want to, on success stories, we had the city of Longmont, who was an entitlement, and they ran multiple programs, housing and infrastructure for their entire county. So they went beyond their borders, up into the mountains, and because of their experience, they did a really great job. And they had an inter-county consortium where they all got together and agreed on priorities, but it was the entitlement community that actually ran the programs. They knew what they were doing. They'd done this before. And we got out $74 million across the entire county with no findings for that particular one. The lesson learned is there's good and bad with this one. The bad news is we had to give $2 million back. The good part of that is, one, we as the state discovered the issue. So it wasn't HUD coming in and saying, hey, you guys screwed up, you owe us money. It was us figuring out there was a problem. We worked with them for about 6 months on their record keeping, trying to get them compliant. And at the end of the day, both parties figured out it was too much work, it couldn't be done. We weren't going to get enough qualified. So they ended up having to give us $2 million back. But the good news for that as well is because our subrecipient agreement was written in the way that it was written, there is no argument, between what the state had to do versus the locals. And at the end of the day, everybody's still friends, and we found other disaster recovery related work to use that $2 million on within their communities.
Okay, so one thing that we do in Texas is a variety of things. Local control is king in Texas. I'll just say to the extreme. Y'all all do local control. We do local control. But you have to think about it both on your abilities as well as your subrecipients' abilities. Do you want to do a direct allocation? Do you want to do a competition? Do you want to do MOUs? Do you want to do NOFAs and RFAs and all of the things? Do you have the staff capable of reviewing all of those things? Will your admin budget support reviewing all of those things? Do they have the staff? One thing that I often do is my program is the CDBG-DR program, and that's what we do at the land office. We do not do the COVID allocation. We do not do the ARPA allocation. We do not do the non-entitlement program. But what we do is we coordinate with each other to make sure that we're not asking for applications at the same time. Because if we're asking for applications and so is the COVID program and so is the annual program, then our subrecipients that we share are going to have to make choices, or they're going to make mistakes more than likely in their applications to all of us and potentially miss out on funding that is critical to them. Another thing to think about is what controls do your subrecipients have in place? So as we go in and we do those kickoff meetings with them, we're talking to them about what does your file system look like? And is it an electronic file system? Is it a paper file system? And we are looking at it from a checklist perspective. We use the HUD checklist, and we are determining if it checks all the boxes ahead of time. And we help them to set those requirements into their programs as they're starting out. Do they have CDBG-DR experience? You all do disaster recovery. A bunch of you do non-entitlement. Some of you are probably doing the entitlement program. I don't know exactly how it works in your world, but we get audited a whole lot more frequently than our entitlement partners do. We have a lot more zeros, a lot more commas. It makes sense to have extra oversight there. But there are things that we are requiring of our subrecipients who are either working with our Department of Agriculture in our non-entitlement program or have a direct relationship with HUD through a different field office. We hear it all the time. Well, Ag doesn't make us do that, or HUD didn't make us do that. So that CDBG-DR experience is definitely something that we consider as we're working with our communities. And I told y'all we have 9 different grants open right now. We have repeat customers. So the city of Galveston gets a contract every time we have a disaster, or all but. They know what they're doing. They're pretty well set up. They have a good understanding of what to do, how to do. But we just started working with Interagency. They hadn't had an event in a while, and they had a whole bunch of new staff since the last time we had been there. So those are things that we're figuring out, and the technical assistance that we're tailoring to their needs. So how have they performed on our previous grants? Were they rock stars, or did they need some extra help? those types of things go into not necessarily who we fund, but how we define the technical assistance, what grant manager we assign to manage their grants with them. We know that this one's going to need a little bit more hand-holding, so they're actually rated a little bit higher on a complexity scale that we put together, and our grant manager is going to get one less grant to manage in their portfolio because of that complexity that we know is coming from that relationship that they're picking out. Then another thing that we do is we look at our subrecipients to see if they're going to manage this in-house. Are we training their staff to do this task, or are they using a vendor? If they're using a vendor, there's a higher level of expertise that we're going to expect of that subrecipient. If they're going to manage it in-house directly, then we're going to teach them how to do that right. So those are things that we are always looking at as we decide how to serve our subrecipients the best way possible.
Right. As I mentioned earlier, the way Colorado runs is we have a series of agencies that run these programs. So we have multiple interagency agreements, and we kind of lean on the expertise of that particular agency. One thing that's very important is involving that other agency upfront in the program design. For example, economic development. Our economic development agency knows businesses, they're good at giving out grants, but, what's a subrogation agreement? They don't know those things. They don't do those things. So partnering with them and making sure they understand the programs and tying all that into the interagency agreement is critical. And you're often dealing with peers. So that's a management challenge. And that's why it's particularly important to have performance criteria in the contract, because we're still responsible as the grantee, regardless of whether our sister agency is running it or not. And again, some of the same things remain true with the same as the subrecipient agreement. You need to be clear on, how often they're going to bill you, how often they're going to provide reporting information, and what that information is going to look like. And you're going to want to spell it all out within the interagency agreement. Just to highlight a couple of best practices, our Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management managed our infrastructure programs. And the reason why they were the right agency to do that is because they're already doing FEMA PA across the impacted area. And a lot of the local governments needed that match. They needed to use DR for match for that. So rather than have them deal with two different state agencies, Homeland Security was able to have one contract for a bridge, for example, and within that there'd be X number of dollars from FEMA, X number of dollars from CDBG-DR, and then any local match that they need to put in there. So it made the management for the subrecipient a lot more fluid by working with our state partners rather than running it as a separate agency. Again, a lesson learned. Some of the state agencies are comfortable. They work with a lot of federal grants. Others don't. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're doing this. And then the least experience they have, the more hand-holding you need and the tighter you need to be within the interagency agreement. And just one final thing. At the end of the day, my boss's name is on the grant agreement with HUD. So if my sister agency messes up, whether they're in the governor's office or whether they're in Homeland Security, wherever, it's still my boss who's over local affairs, which includes all the community development, that has to answer to HUD. So you don't get to abdicate your responsibility, so that makes it even more important to get the interagency agreements right.
All right, a brief word on contract modifications. So I think folks understand that getting the contract management, the contract's laid out, you've got your provisions, you got your scope, you have your term, you've determined your costs and your budget, and then things happen, right? It's, as has been noted in the case studies, things change, situations change, require modification. Pay specific attention to the scope of services. Are you going to find something outside of the scope? Is the budget increase reasonable? Did you consider the potential total cost when you were procuring the service or the good? Is the term being extended beyond a reasonable period, right? You contracted for a 2-year period. Now you want to extend something 8 or 10 years. Is that reasonable? Can it be justified? There are reasons why things happen. There are reasons why things are extended. Budgets are increased. Scopes are flexed a bit, but you need to be able to justify it, right? You can't modify a contract for the sake of modifying it without being able to back up why and still meeting the principles around procurement. So that alignment between your procurement policies and procedures, particularly as it relates to contract modifications, becomes very much interconnected with your contract management process over its duration. You want to make sure you can be flexible to the degree that it makes sense and the degree that it's justifiable, but you have to stay within some reasonable boundaries there. You have to stay within some reasonable parameters. Task orders, as Dave mentioned, are a great management tool. It's something you see more and more with folks who have been in this business for a while. Contract amendments take a very long time, as some of the folks who work with their legal departments can attest to. Looking at you, Dan, back there. But no, in all seriousness, there's tools you can use, right, to make these processes more time friendly, more accommodating to all parties involved. Task orders are a great tool there. There's lots of good examples of those that other grantees have developed. It's really something where, work with your peers in this and say, how did you structure that contract? Was it just the actual document? Did you do task orders, purchase orders? There's different ways to structure it in different areas, but use the tools at your disposal to support your successful management of a contract. Anticipate what you can, right? There are emergencies that come up, but not everything is an emergency. Not everything has to be rushed or expedited. Typically, if you plan ahead, you're not caught in that time where you are trying to do something from an emergency perspective. You're trying to justify something as a true emergency. That's rare. Typically, things are rushed or expedited or filed under something of an emergency nature because it just there wasn't a lot of planning that went into it. Wasn't a lot of forethought in terms of how things would play out over time. So just consider how best you can anticipate things that are obviously within your control. Just a few more slides here and we'll get to Q&A. So just some common challenges and maybe thinking about how best to address them. There's a natural push and pull between the regulatory requirements and really considering the needs of what you need out of a contract, right? Just be thoughtful about it. Strike a balance. Obviously, you need to be compliant, but also where you have flexibilities, where there is some deference, use it in a way that makes sense. And be thoughtful about how you engage. Don't just take a boilerplate contract from something else and apply it to every situation. Be thoughtful about how you enter into those agreements with your vendors and subrecipients. There is a level of precision and specificity that's really important here. Know where your dollars are going. Know what you're paying for. Track it to the penny as best you can. Know when deliverables are coming in, that they meet the requirements of what you laid out in a contract. Too often, folks are not really sure what they're paying for. And you should, right? You're investing federal dollars. You're supporting the recovery of communities. You should know where your money's going, and you should be getting what you're paying for. Coordination and communication across all parties is absolutely critical. You've got internal stakeholders, you've got your finance folks, your procurement folks, you've got a contract manager that is very often different than your program manager. Everyone has to work together from a perspective of contract management to be successful. Also, not to mention the external parties, right? Your vendors, your subrecipients, that coordination is really key. So the lack of that, the absence of that causes challenges throughout the process, as you well know. And then finally, again, on the timeliness piece, contract management, it just takes time, right? There are lengthy processes from a contracting process, legal reviews, multiple layers of approvals. Working in state and local government, it just is, in its nature, can be slow. Give yourself the time to do it well, right? Bake in that time. Think about it as you're planning over the course of your grant, and really plan to do it well and follow these principles across that full duration. We will not read from the consolidated notice. I know everyone would love a dramatic reading of the notice, but that's not going to happen. But no, just to point out a few things, they are obviously very critical to be aware of. There are requirements, right? So think about how you're putting these into your agreements. Cost controls and warranties. The website requirements. So there's items that have to be posted to your website. Procurement policy procedures, the contracts themselves. And then finally, pieces around contract provisions, performance requirements, making sure that those are incorporated. make sure you're aware of the consolidated notice, the requirements associated therein, and, do what you got to do to be compliant, and you'll be in good shape. All right.
Ted, let me read off the poll results while they're
Go.
thinking of their questions. All right, just for everybody's context, I've never been called an expert in being able to do something electronic, but the poll was pretty easy to set up. Does your agency contract outside vendor support? 102 of 111 responses were yes. So while this was an extremely exciting topic for the end of the day, I think it's an important one. Y'all are all contracting. And then we're split about 50-50 on whether or not you procure your vendors after your event happens or whether you pre-position them. My advice to you is pre-position anything you absolutely can. You can't guess for sure. We pre-positioned stuff and then we had an ice storm in Texas, so we weren't ready for that. We pre-positioned everything else. And then do you limit who your subrecipients are? Again, y'all are at about 50-50 with 77 total answers. Yes, you do limit who your subrecipients can be. Do y'all have questions for us? Everybody ready for dinner?
There's a question.
Hi, Alex Pennington. I'm with